Hello and welcome to this seminar on the 8 essential principles of classical pedagogy. Okay, there might not actually be 8. This number didn't fall down from heaven, but there's a nice little alliteration there, 8 essential principles. Maybe we should try to go for 7 because 7 is sometimes considered a number for perfection. So there's something arbitrary about these 8 principles, but I think it's helpful to list some of the most important principles of traditional classical pedagogy for the sake of clarity for those of us who are educators in the classical renewal. Why? Well, often teachers want to find practices quickly, practical ways, practical techniques of teaching in the classroom. It's important to be thinking about technique and doing good classroom teaching and management and so forth. But practice is always informed by principles or by philosophy or by theory. The trouble with talking about theory or philosophy or even principles is that sometimes we can lift ourselves up out of the real world of classroom instruction and teaching, coaching and discussion. That is a tendency and that needs to be resisted. On the other hand, our practices, if they're not informed by clear principles, are going to be diminished and impoverished. I think it was Kant who said that practice without theory or philosophy is blind. And we might say that philosophy without practices is kind of pointless. So I like to think of principles and practice as an ongoing dance. There's an ongoing dialectic, if you will, an ongoing interchange between these two things. In this particular seminar, I'm going to be focusing mainly on principles, but I think if we understand the principles clearly and deeply, the practices often will suggest themselves. Often when I'm training with faculty, I'll work on a particular principle with them and then just ask them to suggest the practices that are coming to them as we think about the principles, and they're often very easily discovered. So I think there's some practical value, if you will, to spending some of our time thinking deeply about the principles that come down to us, pedagogical principles that come down to us in the tradition of classical education. So I'm going to go through 8 of them. This should take about 40 to 45 minutes. I'm going to suggest some resources to you for further study as well, particularly some books. But I think after you've considered some of these principles, many of you who are in schools and homeschools and co-ops can take them and begin to have discussions on your own that will be very fruitful. Here are the eight essential principles. Festina lente, the first 3 are from the Latin. Festina lente, which means to make haste slowly. Multum non multa, which means much, not many. Repetitio mater memoriae, which means repetition is the mother of memory. And then embodied learning using songs, chants, and jingles, wonder and curiosity, the educational virtues, and schole, contemplation, and leisure. Well, let's start with these first 3 Latin maxims, and you'll see there's some relationships between them as well. These are Latin maxims, pedagogical maxims that have come down to us. Festina lente means to make haste slowly. You know what it's like to rush through things and then find that you've really wasted your time. You know what it's like to be so busy that you think, I just don't have time to think about my day and do much planning or organizing. I just need to jump into my day. I'm already behind. But that's actually not a wise move, is it? We know that if we spend, say, 20 minutes of planning before our day begins, or an hour of planning before our week begins, we will recover many times, perhaps 5-10 times as much efficiency and time back as that invested 20 minutes or hour. How many times have you engaged in a project that you just jumped into with maybe even with enthusiasm? Maybe there wasn't any anxiety about it in terms of a rush for time because you felt limited by time. Maybe you're just excited about a project around your house. You wanted to jump right in. I have that tendency from time to time. What often happens? Get into the project and realize you've wasted some time. Think of the carpenter's maxim. Do you know that carpenter's maxim? Measure twice, cut once. how many times have I been working on some project where I had one 2x4 left and I didn't measure twice, I just measured once, I made the cut and put it up and found that I was an inch short, and now that 2x4 was good for nothing on my project, and I had to go down to the Home Depot or Lowe's or what have you and get another length of 2x4. So we've all experienced this, and it works as well in education. We need to make haste slowly. We need to work with our students in ways that ensure mastery. By jumping on ahead, being overly ambitious and zealous, it might look good. Our kids are actually doing Algebra 1, a year ahead of time, maybe 2 years ahead of time, maybe 3 years ahead of time. Do you know that my 10-year-old is already starting to do algebra? But we're not mastering each step as we go. And actually, we're violating one of the educational virtues. And all of these principles are related, by the way, so I'm kind of jumping down here for a moment to the educational virtues. One of the virtues is temperance. When it comes to education, temperance means not being overly ambitious and zealous and tackling something beyond your capacity. It also, on the other end, means not being lazy. To be lazy and to not exercise your capacities properly according to their strength, laziness or sloth, is also a violation of temperance. It's intemperate. So we want a kind of properly adjusted and aligned balance to the given capacities of a student and ourselves. So festina lente means to make haste slowly. It's related to teaching to mastery. For example, in Latin, if students have not mastered their basic vocabulary, I'm thinking particularly here of grammar school, upper elementary school students, if they haven't mastered their basic vocabulary, or if they haven't mastered, say, their first declension noun endings, I, am, I, autumn, is, us, is, moving on to the next concept can be problematic without having mastered this preliminary concept, and I'm sure you've seen this happen. We need to master each step along the way. As Serre-Lange, the French writer, comments, we need to get to the sea. Eventually we'll get to the sea, but we do it first by ways of a tributary, rivulet, a tributary, a river, and then eventually the sea. But we master each step as we go. Another analogy would be in mathematics. You can't do long division without having mastered multiplication and addition. You just can't, because long division requires that skill. So to move ahead without having mastered something is a problem. And in modern progressive education, there is a tendency to cover material, to check off the boxes, to finish the chapter and go on, especially if you're teaching a class of 30 or 35 students. Some are not mastering the concept. Well, we need to go on. That's a challenge. Festina lente tells us to master each step as we go. This is related to a corollary maxim, multum non multa. If we're going to master concepts, we can't do too many of them at a time. We can't be tracking, say, 10 subjects at a time and expect students to go deep in them and master them and actually love them. And that's kind of what we do in progressive education. It's not uncommon for a junior high school student to have 8 periods of about 43 minutes each, by which he moves at the signal of a bell, carrying a backpack that's about 25 pounds and so on. But in addition to those eight periods, he might be doing an elective, so let's make that 9 subjects, and then he's also doing extramurals. He might be taking an instrument as well. It easily can get to 10 or 11 activities, most of which he's being graded on a weekly basis with a numerical grade. Well, that can kill love of the arts. It can kill love of learning, to use that cliche, because we're trying to do too much. Multum non multa means much, not many. Nicholas Carr, a modern writer, has written a book called The Shallows about how the internet is making us stupid. And in this book, Nicholas Carr, it was published maybe 4 years ago or so, he first wrote an article about, I think it was an article entitled How Google's Making Us Stupid. But Nicholas Carr, writing in his 40s, says, because of the way that he has been dabbling in the internet and surfing and via internet research and reading and so forth, he has lost the ability to attend, to read longer articles and novels and follow a longer line of argumentation. He writes himself that this is for himself that this is a problem. And isn't it true for all of us? In the age that we're living, it is easy to be diffused and distracted and to be spread thin. And somewhere C.S. Lewis talks about too little butter being spread over too much toast. Our classical forebears would say, multum non multa. It is better to go deep with a few things and master them than to be a dilettante with many. And then, of course, this leads us again to covering material. How many of us can say, well, yeah, I took Spanish in high school, and what's the next thing that is said? But don't ask me to say anything. We have taken courses and not learned them. We have not been required to master that which was before us. And part of the problem is because we were asked to do 8 things at once, marching forward on 8 fronts, knowing that we're not going to master any of those arts or subjects creates its own kind of discouragement and a particular frame of mind, which is basically I'm a dilettante, getting my passport punched, covering material, but never really mastering anything and never having the time to go deep. Apply this to English literature. How would you like to take an English literature class, say as a 9th grader, and do 22 novels? How about 32? Why not more? I mean, the more English literature we can absorb, the better. Well, more is not always better, is it? Sometimes less is more. That's kind of another way of saying multum non multa. Better to go deep with a few and really own them and love them than to cursorily cover a lot of novels and not really know them or love them. This is what's happened to so many of us with Shakespeare, for example. How many of you studied Shakespeare in the 9th grade? Maybe you read Macbeth and you did it in 2 or 3 weeks. Maybe it was Julius Caesar or Othello, one of these famous plays. Maybe it was King Lear. And then how many of us have to confess that we don't really get or love Shakespeare? Why? Well, because we were covering so much material in 9th grade literature, we had 3 weeks for Macbeth. And to get into Shakespeare requires a longer study, doesn't it? Just to be acquainted with the Elizabethan English, to know something about the history and biography of Shakespeare himself, who was so prolific, and there's rich things to be learned there. And then to see the complex ways that he uses language. Beautiful, yes, but complex and not easily entered into at first. So many adults say, well, if the truth be known, I don't really know or like Shakespeare. Well, if you don't like Shakespeare, it's not Shakespeare's fault. He is the master writer. We know that. The tradition, history, even modern critics tell us Shakespeare is great, but we have never had enough time with Shakespeare. We simply didn't have enough time. And beyond that, we probably did not have a teacher who had had enough time with Shakespeare. We probably had a teacher who, to some degree, was going through the motions, who did not have a deep love for the bard. And if we have a teacher who is teaching us, in this case, literature, and not loving that literature, we're already disadvantaged from the beginning. So it's better to do a deep dive with, say, 6 or 7 novels, especially in 9th grade, and really own and love them, really understand them and enter into them, than to do 2 or 3 times that many and never acquire that love. C.S. Lewis says in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he talks about this and says, by teaching too many subjects or arts at a time, what we deprive students of is the hope of ever mastering anything. When C.S. Lewis was about 14, he was tutored. He was blessed to be tutored by a retired Scottish schoolmaster that he called the Great Knock. And for 3 years, C.S. Lewis studied Latin and Greek with the Great Knock. But through Latin and Greek, he studied a lot of the literature in Greek plays, Greek tragedies, Greek histories. Same thing with the Latin or Roman history. He was studying some really great literature, history, philosophy, and so on, and playwrights. And then every day the great Knock would argue with C.S. Lewis about his viewpoints and asking for evidence and support and so forth. He was learning dialectic and literary assessment or criticism by his daily exchanges with the great Knock. He said it was those 3 years that enabled him to get into Oxford. Well, I'm not suggesting that we need to say go to 3 subjects or go to 2 subjects, just Latin and Greek, but there's something to be learned here. Can we do fewer things well and find that we go farther and deeper in the long run because of this? I think it's Doug Wilson in his book, Recovering the Lost Tools, that mentions a German chemist named Bohr who was reflecting on the kind of students who came to him to study science at the college or university level. And he noted something. He noted that the students who had been in the science magnet schools, if you will, who had really focused in their high school years on studying as much upper level science as they could, when they came to study chemistry with him, they did better than those students who had had the more classical education, who didn't specialize so much in science. But then he noted this. After a year or two, the classically educated students began to surpass those who had the specialized science education. And then he said, give me a student who knows his Latin, and I shall be responsible for his chemistry. So sometimes bounding forward and trying to do more in the long term is actually counterproductive. So it's worth reflecting on this principle in your classes, in your homeschools and co-ops. How would multum non multa possibly change the way you conceive of and then actually teach in your school? The third one, the third Latin maxim is the repetitio mater memoriae. It's often attributed to Seneca, and it means repetition is the mother of memory. The Latin word est, meaning is just assumed in this sentence. Repetition, the mother of memory. And this is an insight in particular for younger students, but it applies to older students as well. Think about how younger students love to repeat things they enjoy. Think of, say, your typical second grader, first grader, third grader. If a third grader loves something, he's going to keep revisiting it. He's going to dramatize it. He's going to talk about it. He's going to draw pictures about it. And this is as it should be. Students at this particular age in their development are generally filled with curiosity, awe, and wonder at the world. And when they find something that is beautiful, true, good, they might call it neat or cool, but it's the true, the good, the beautiful, they begin to focus on it and play with it and turn it over and over again in their hands or mind. That's good. In fact, we want to teach, as Dorothy Sayre says, with that grain. We want to actually cultivate that and then make use of it in our teaching. So repetition is by no means a foe to the educator. Repetition is our friend. And it's particularly our friend in the grammar school years. I visit and train at a lot of classical schools, and I still note that there is, in my view, far too little use of creative repetition in our schools. I think it's because we, as adults, think, that's not normally what adults want to do. We don't want to repeat things over and over again, although we do that as well. Maybe just not to the degree and with the frequency that younger kids do. Just to focus on that for a moment, think about the last time you saw a movie that you really loved. About a year ago, I saw the movie by Terry Maddock. What's it called? This beautiful film. I want to say It's Life is Beautiful, but that's a different movie. It'll come to me. But this very beautiful film that I couldn't help just describing. I still describe it to people. That Tree of Life. The Tree of Life is a beautiful film, an unusual film, a surprising film. I'd love to talk to you about it now. But I have praised that song to 24 different people. I still love to talk about it. Well, how much more with children when they're discovering something for the first time that is true and good and beautiful. And isn't it part of what we're trying to do as educators is to introduce them to something that is true, good, and beautiful, and let that beautiful, true, and good thing do its work on their souls. And if we do that, they are going to want that experience as much as possible again and again. They're going to want to play with it. So let's make use of that. And what happens is by using repetition, by visiting things, and not always in the same form, repetition doesn't mean you do the exact same thing over and over again, but you're looking at, and viewing, and discussing, and thinking about some object of truth, goodness, and beauty over and over again in different ways. So, for example, there's a room for songs, jingles, and chants is a way of doing this, and I'll skip forward to 5 for just a moment. Maybe I'll just go there. Probably should have reversed 4 and 5 here, as I'm thinking about it now. Kids love to sing, so younger kids in particular. So why not have them sing their Latin declension endings and their conjugation endings? They're going to sing "Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, Catch a Tigger by a Toe" and all kinds of other little schoolyard songs that they've learned, or they're going to hear a jingle on the radio or some other catchy tune and they'll sing that. They're going to sing, they're going to repeat. So let's use their propensity to sing as a way of as a pedagogical tool. Now, to get back to an earlier point, in far too many schools that I visit, there is far less chanting, singing, use of repetition in grammar schools than I think we should do. I think there's still a large propensity, because of the way we were taught, to cover material, but not enable students to master it. And if we're going to enable students to truly master material, we're going to need to come back to it again and again, because repetition is the mother of memory. I wonder if it's partly by design that our constitution, our brains, our brain perhaps is saying to us, well, if you come back to this 7 or 8 or 9 times, I'll know that you really mean it, and then I'll give you the space and actually store this away in your deep memory. So, but you've got to prove it to me by coming back to it about 10 times. It reminds me of getting back to this idea of mastery. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers: The Story of Success, he cites some research that seems to show, that if you're going to be a virtuoso or a bona fide expert, not using that word lightly, but a true expert, a true master in a particular skill or art, you'll need to spend 10,000 hours working on that art. So to take the violin, for example, if you want to be the best that you can possibly be as a human being playing the violin, you'll need to invest 10,000 hours of time. That's what we see happens with people who master something. That's about 10 years of work. 10 years of working at something, say 3 hours a day. It's a lot of time. It's a slow process. We need to kind of go back to understanding great education as something that takes time. The Jesuits of old didn't finish their education until they were 33. So, to cite Plato, he said you weren't really qualified to become a guardian or a ruler of the polis or city until you had reached age 50. I finally have qualified for that. I hadn't thought about that. That's kind of encouraging. So we need time, and we need to be able to repeat things, and we need to perhaps do fewer subjects, fewer arts, and really master them. So all of these things are kind of related, aren't they? Repetitio mater memoriae. So are you regularly coming back to things that are important? Because the things that you really want students to master, you can't just cover in a week and check it off and say, well, I did that. I taught that particular concept. No, it needs to be exercised and reviewed until it's actually mastered, until it's in the deep memory and constitution of a student. That might mean that our goals and objectives need to be reviewed, revised possibly. Maybe we're trying to do too much. Do you know that 75% of the material that's presented in the form that you're enjoying right now, the kind of standard didactic lecture format, 75% of it will be forgotten in about a week's time? That's kind of sad, isn't it? Because here I am using this particular mode of teaching, and I'm thinking, you're going to forget this very soon. So why do we do it? Well, it's because this will be archived on YouTube. You go back to it again and again. That's helpful. But we don't retain things that are taught this way very well. So just to check it off and say, well, I presented that in the classroom and I gave them a little quiz and most of the kids got A's and B's, I'm done. Not necessarily. Maybe that's a ruse. That's why you can't speak any Spanish even today. So what are we doing with our time? It's worth thinking about. How many, if those of you who are in the Christian tradition and go to church and hear sermons, can you tell me what the pastor preached on 2 weeks ago? I hope that makes my point. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't listen to those kinds of things, but their value is probably much more limited than we think. Okay, but you can remember the people who have influenced you over time and the things that you've actually been made to do and master. Of course, those things are a part of you now. I'm going to move on now to number 4. I've kind of already hit songs and jingles, although I'll return to it briefly. Embodied learning simply means there's an insight that comes down to us in the tradition that education is not merely a rational process. And since the Enlightenment, a lot of our thinking about what learning is considered to be a rational enterprise. So we tend to think if I can communicate the right ideas to my students, I've done education. Now, that is true. It's at least partially true. Learning and understanding the right ideas is very, very important. But the way in which we actually come to believe and act and think and love doesn't have as much to do with an intellectual interchange or a rational interchange as we think. This particular book, I think, demonstrates this. It's a book by James K.A. Smith called Desiring the Kingdom, Worship, Worldview, and Cultural Formation. Classical Academic Press sells it, but you can get it on Amazon and other places as well. Tremendous book. He says that we need to be careful about thinking of education too much as information, when in fact what education also needs to be is formation, perhaps even prevalently so. Not just imparting facts and ideas, but forming the soul and character and heart of the student, helping shape that orientation, cultivate the orientation of a person's soul towards an ideal of human flourishing. And that happens through the 5 senses, he argues, more than it happens through rational interchanges like the one you're enjoying right now, or not enjoying. In other words, atmospherics has a lot to do with what students end up believing and thinking and feeling. In fact, James K. Smith says in many ways we feel our way around the world more than we think our way around the world, contrary to what, say, Enlightenment rationalism would suggest to us. So some corollaries, or at least some implications from this, are that we need to pay attention to what happens with the 5 senses, what happens through the 5 senses in our schools and home schools, in our educational settings. Charlotte Mason, I think, understood this insight. Charlotte Mason, an educational theorist, a British educational theorist who is largely classical in my view, she says that a school should be more like a home than anything else. It ought not to be so institutional. The architecture, the very architecture and physical surroundings in a school take their cues not from this classical tradition, but really from efficient construction of buildings that come from the modernist age, construction of rectangular buildings that are cheaper to construct, more efficient use of space, and also akin to what we see with factories. So most schools are big rectangular boxes with multiple stories and fluorescent lights and bells and so forth. They're really not like a home, are they? They're really not that inviting. When's the last time you walked into a classroom and thought, it's so lovely to be here? The way you would feel, say, when you walk into one of your favorite restaurants on an anniversary night. The fluorescent lights are killing right from the beginning. The way everything is set up. Are the rooms, what's on the walls of the typical classroom? Is it something that refreshes you or not? It's usually a collage, a potpourri, a hodgepodge of educational aids that are clashing with one another, both in terms of their content and their form. It doesn't really put you in a mood to contemplate and think about the true and the good and the beautiful. We need to rethink architecture. We need to rethink decor because they are having an impact. James K.A. Smith points out that the things that are really impacting students is not the teacher in front of a whiteboard. That's not what primarily what is shaping the orientation of a boy's soul or a girl's soul. What is it in our culture today that is really shaping their and cultivating their affections and loves? It's not the teacher in front of the whiteboard. What is it? Well, just watch what a student does when he leaves the school. What does he do? iPod comes out, earphones go in, computer comes out, smartphone comes out, Facebook, movies, video clips, surfing the web, all kinds of music, athletics, sports, going to the mall. James Smith in his book, it has an interesting section where he describes what it might be like for a Martian sociologist to visit an American mall. And it makes you laugh and, kind of mourn at the same time, because he describes the mall as really a kind of religious institution. There's liturgies going on there. There's iconography there in the mall. These vestments and of the ideal life and icons of what it would look like for you to be a flourishing human being. And then there seems to be these priests and priestesses having some Eucharistic exchanges as you acquire all the accoutrement that you need to be a flourishing human being. And we always go in groups. It's social. It's a collective experience. There's even aromas pumped into these various chapels in these large cathedrals that we call malls. These liturgies, these secular liturgies that we encounter in the culture, like in a mall, are very much shaping the souls of our students more powerfully than Mrs. Johnson in front of her whiteboard. We need to think about that. So what would need to change? We need to have, in Smith's view, we need to have counterformative liturgies of our own. And he says that pedagogies are liturgies, and that we need to make use of what he calls a liturgy or a pedagogy of desire. We need to learn how to cultivate the love of truth, goodness, and beauty in our students. And the typical pedagogical methods that we employ are not doing that. Read the book. There's much more to say about that. Desiring the kingdom. So, pay attention to the body. And by the way, he's just appealing to the Augustinian tradition. And even to Plato and Aristotle, that a big part of what education is to train students to love what is lovely. When we're tired, how do we teach? When you're fatigued, how do you teach? Even if you've been trained in some classical pedagogy, when you're tired at the end of the day, how do you teach? If you're a parent, when you're really tired and fatigued, how do you discipline your children? The way you were disciplined. How do you teach? The way you were taught. Don't underestimate the way your own soul has been shaped by 7 hours a day for 13 years or more in progressive educational institutions that have a different anthropology and a different view of what education is. To cite Smith again, he says that every pedagogy assumes an anthropology. In fact, if you go to classicaleducator.com, you can see a clip of him talking about this in an interview format. It's very, very interesting. Show me how you teach, and I can show you what your view of a human being is. What is a human being, after all? That particular philosophy, if you will, has everything to do with the practical ways we teach. Charlotte Mason says that even that little 4-year-old that you're reading to is a person. Every child is a person and needs to be respected as a person, bearing the image of God. Okay, I have individual seminars for each of these points, but I need to move on. Let's go to wonder and curiosity. Is that part of the classical tradition? Is that a pedagogical principle? Wonder? Curiosity? It's David Hicks in his book, Norms and Nobility, which I also highly suggest. It's also available on the Classical Academic Press website. He says that at the heart of classical education is a spirit of inquiry. If we're not cultivating a curious, wondering spirit, then we're not really that much aligned with the tradition. Students need to become curious and be at awe in this wonderful cosmos in which we've been placed. At awe with the world, with human beings, with themselves, and with God, who has authored it all and created it all. children come with built-in wonder. You know, if I were to bring in a cool-looking red frog in front of a group of second graders in a little terrarium or something, they will all rush to the table and look at it, and you will hear various sounds of awe and wonder. Won't you? That's good. It comes built in. Well, that needs to be cultivated, and it needs to be protected, because at about 7th grade, something about our cultural experience begins to kill that wonder and curiosity, and learning can no longer be cool for a lot of our 13-year-olds. That's what these other secular liturgies are doing. They're doing their work on the souls of our kids, and we're fighting it with 90% of our time in front of a whiteboard, like I'm doing. It's very limited in terms of its power. So curiosity and wonder. I'm going to cite another book, Josef Pieper, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. This book reacquainted me with the tradition of wonder in education. He says that wonder leads us to worship and then leads us to wisdom. So that's what these 3 W's stand for here, if you were wondering. Wonder, leading to worship, which leads to wisdom. So that one way of conceiving the classical tradition of education is not just grammar, logic, and rhetoric, but it's wonder to worship to wisdom. Does your curriculum and your school experience, is it characterized by this kind of movement? Do you see 8th and 9th graders are still at wonder in the world? And are they moved to praise and commend and exclaim their admiration for the world in which they've been placed, the cosmos, for God himself, for humanity? That's going to lead to wisdom. Very much worth a read. Leisure, the Basis of Culture. I'll talk more about it in just a couple of minutes. For just a moment, I'm going to pause here and take a look at this diagram. If we can think of wonder to worship to wisdom as one way of conceiving of classical education, what do you think these other boxes represent? How about these boxes here? I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think there's 13 of them. Now, if I said there were 12 of them, I think you would immediately know what they mean. Do you? Right. This is K through 12 education. So we have kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th. This is the typical way we think of the sequence of education in America. Well, that's not always how it was thought about. So I just would point out that this particular grading concept is not really something that comes to us clearly from the classical tradition, and yet it's part of our life now. It doesn't mean that it's bad or that we shouldn't use it, but maybe we should at least receive it with some degree of skepticism and criticism. We at least should assess it and ask ourselves, how are we going to make use of it if we're going to? A lot of education in the classical tradition, for example, was single-sex education. And we might say, well, we're going to be critical of the tradition. We don't always want to do what the tradition says, but we do receive it with respect. Excuse me. But that's for another discussion. There's some reasons why right now during this period of renewal that we have dual sex education. Well, what do you think these 3 blocks here represent? I think some of you have been involved with this renewal for a while will immediately see that these 3 sections represent grammar, logic, and rhetoric. This is Sayre's insight from an essay speech she gave in 1947 at Oxford, speaking to some teachers. And she said, you know, these arts, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the trivium arts, which are the verbal arts, they actually correspond to child development. And so really it's interesting, but to teach the art of grammar is best done when kids are young. So from, say, K to 6, this is when we're going to teach grammar. And from grade 7 to 9 or so, when a child is, say, from 12, 13, or 14 years old, that's the time to teach dialectic or logic. So we could say there's a kind of progression as to the sequence of when you teach these subjects. And of course, high school years seems to be an appropriate time to teach rhetoric. Well, I think there's some insight to that. But of course, what's being left out here is that the classical tradition doesn't just focus on grammar, logic, and rhetoric, as important as those are. So every diagram, every concept, way of conceiving of something can have some limitations as well as some strengths. So I'm going to give you another way of looking at it, because where's the quadrivium here? Where's mathematics? Where are the sciences? Where's geometry, astronomy, or physics, and so on? Well, there's another way I think that we can conceive of this, and I'll just write down P, G, M, A, P, and T. There's a new book coming out called The Liberal Arts Tradition, Philosophy of Classical Christian Education by Ravi Jain and Kevin Clark. And they've done a great job of uncovering the way in which, in the classical tradition from the Middle Ages on, education was also conceived of, not by 12 grades, not by grammar, logic, and rhetoric as the main way of understanding all that was involved in education, although this was clearly a kind of paradigm that was used in various ways. Dorothy Sayers is using it in a particularly new way in 1947, but still in keeping with many things in the tradition. P stands for piety. This G stands for gymnastic. M stands for music, or I'm going to call it musicae, because to make a distinction between music as we typically think of it when learning an instrument and so forth, music as ratio. The arts, as in the liberal arts, and then philosophy and theology. Moving through education, in the early years, students were taught to have piety, respect for the elders, love their tradition, enter into their tradition, and venerate it. And they did that in a number of different ways that we'll talk about in a second. Gymnastic, of course, is akin to PE and recess. It's the exercise of the body. But it wasn't merely the exercise of the body. It also helped to form friendships and fellowship and so forth, and reinforce the learning that was happening in more of a classroom setting. And then musicae was, all of those disciplines that were inspired by the muses, including poetry, history, singing, polyhymnia, singing, one of the names of the muses, dancing as well. So choral singing, the recitation of poetry, the reading of history and literature, the history and literature of your people, which is one way of showing piety. This was musicae, the arts that were inspired by the muses. So it didn't mean music like learning how to play the lyre or the flute. That was another kind of use of the word music. That was a part of the quadrivium that came later in the study of the arts. But musicae becomes kind of a musical education, so that in these grammar school years, classical education was musical education. That's where literature and poetry and history fit into a classical curriculum. Because if you think about it, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and then arithmetic, astronomy, music, and geometry, the quadrivium subjects, where's literature and history? Well, literature and history become musical education, and then as you continue through your education, they become kind of like a playground for all of the liberal arts that you're learning. So sometimes kindergarten or first grade teachers will ask me, I teach kindergarten, how do I teach classically? Well, one of the ways that you teach classically that's very, very important is that you are teaching piety, gymnastic, and musicae. You're teaching them, of course, to read and write, and you are teaching them to be at wonder in the world. I mean, it's our primary school educators, in kindergarten through, say, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. These are the ones who are able to much more easily shape the hearts of our students to an ideal of what it means to be a flourishing human being. Isn't that great? That's how you, as a kindergarten teacher, are classical primarily, is that you shape powerfully the trajectory of a human soul so that they will be in love with truth, goodness, and beauty. You do it so well that by the time they're in 12th grade, they've retained what you've done. The imprint in their soul that's happened in, say, K through 3 or 4 remains with them for a lifetime. That's how you're classical. In other words, the grammar school should, in one respect, be leading the entire school because it's the pulsing light of wonder and awe at truth, goodness, and beauty. Isn't that phenomenal? I get so excited about that. So there's a sense in which the 12th graders need to come back down to 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade and see that wonder and awe and curiosity and love unadulterated and pure and innocent and unimpeded They need to see it to be reminded that that needs to continue to be protected and cultivated in their 12th grade soul. So to kind of turn things on their head a little bit, yes, there's a sense in which the upper school teachers lead the school. They're the capstone of the classical education. But there's another sense in which the kindergarten teacher leads the school. Because if those 12th graders lose their wonder, they're really losing everything. Okay. Then there's the arts, and this involves all 7 liberal arts. It involves the trivium and the quadrivium. And then there's philosophy and theology, that as students mature through a study of the arts, after having this kind of primary education in piety, gymnastics, and musicae, they're ready to begin to do these higher arts, which involve philosophy and theology. Theology being considered to be the queen of all of the arts and the true capstone study. Well, I'd love to say more about that, but I'll stop for a moment. But there's another way of conceiving of how education actually works in the classical tradition. I encourage you to get that book, The Liberal Arts Tradition by Ravi Jain and Kevin Clark. Let's finish up with a discussion of the educational virtues and schole, contemplation, and leisure. The educational virtues. If you don't have a student who has educational virtues, sometimes these are called student virtues or intellectual virtues. If you don't have these student virtues, you really don't have a student. If you don't have a student who has love and humility, if you don't have a student characterized by courage and temperance and perseverance and diligence and constancy, you have something other than a student. Because at the root of the word student, from the Latin word studere, is someone who is zealous and eager. And of course, to be a student is to be as someone who is zealous and eager for truth, goodness, and beauty. You will study the things that you love. So this means it's very important that beyond just teaching content to students, we are actually participating with parents, if you're a teacher who's not a parent, in loco parentis, to cultivate love, humility, constancy, temperance, courage. These attributes need to be a part of a student in order for that student to really sail. Because when those virtues are present, the student is a student even when the teacher is not around. You find the kid who's under his blanket at 10 o'clock at night, violating the household rules because he's got to read the next Chronicle of Narnia and he's got a flashlight under the blanket. He is a student. He is learning even when you're not around. So if you have a group of students who don't have these virtues, what do you have? Something other than students. And you're really doing something other than learning. So it is a fundamental thing that applies as time goes by. We need to impart these virtues. And do you know there's a tradition that talks about this? The book that acquainted me with this is this book by the French writer, wrote in the 40s, called The Intellectual Life by A.G. Sertalange. Its spirit, conditions, and methods. And before you think of this as like a highbrow book about how to be an intellectual, think again. It's about how to acquire and cultivate and develop the kind of traits, virtues, and habits that enable you to be a student of truth, goodness, and beauty. That's what it's about. He says some remarkable things in this book. He talks about how every real study begins with ecstasy. When I read that, I thought, what is he thinking? But he means it in the sense that the word ecstasy literally means to be lifted out of your foothold, the place for which you stand. Stasis is a stationary point in which you're standing. Ek means out of. It means to be lifted out of the place in which you are situated. And so every study begins with ecstasy. It means to be caught up in your mind's eye with something that is true, good, and beautiful, that you say to yourself, I would have that. I want to have that. And then you begin to be a student. When you are caught up with the true, the good, and the beautiful. So the principle here is that teachers, to some degree, have to find ways of holding up before students that which is really true and really good and really beautiful and really meaningful, so that students say to themselves, I would have that too. I want that. Help me to have it. It's Sertalange who says that study is a prayer to the truth. And it is he who says that study, being a student, is a divine office, because when you encounter any truth, you're encountering truth itself, the truth, God himself, who is truth and is also love. and that all truths are in communication with one another. And he says we are really helping students to walk in the path of the divine walker, as another writer put it, to think God's thoughts after him. It's a remarkable way of thinking about education that's been lost in this progressive moment that we're in. And we need to recover it. Do you have these virtues? The word diligence itself is an interesting study. Diligence comes from diligere, which means to esteem highly or prize. It means to love in that sense. So when Jerome translated the Greek in John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, Jerome didn't use the word amare, to love. He used diligere, diligere, to esteem highly, to prize. God so prized and esteemed the world that he sent his Son. So diligence, you will be diligent about the things that you esteem and prize and love. Again, returning us back to this idea that education at its root is loving the things that are lovely and cultivating loving affections for the things that are true, good, and beautiful. I'll be offering a seminar on just the educational virtues, but read Sertalange's book. You'll be in very good shape. And then lastly, to finish up, schole, contemplation, and leisure, another principle that comes down to us. What does this mean? Well, schole is a Greek word. And from this word schole, we get the German word schule, and we get the Latin word schola, and we get the English word school. What does schole mean in Greek? What does it mean? The neighborhood school, and something you find around the corner at the polis? No. Did it mean Plato's Academy, a place where people would gather to do higher learning? No. Schole meant leisure. It meant contemplation. It meant really good conversation. It meant reflection. It meant having the time to really pursue and discuss and think, converse about the things that really matter, the true, good, and beautiful. In fact, the Greek word for the kind of work that you had to do to earn your bread was called aschole, not being at leisure. And this came through even into the Latin language. Otium meant leisure. Negotium, from which we get negotiate, means business, means to not be at leisure, business. So the ancients realized that an important part of education is to actually have the time. You had to be liberated. You had to be a free man. That's why the arts are called the liberal arts. You had to have the free time and the means to pursue these things that really humanized you and helped you to become the best version of yourself. And that meant contemplation. It meant slow education. So again, this comes back to something we talked about earlier in the seminar. We rush. Modern education is an education in anxiety and freneticness. We are running around way too much. We're way too stressed, and we don't ever feel like we have the time to really enter into it. We rarely feel like that. So think about this. When students come into your class, is there a spirit of anxiety and rush and frenzy? Or is there a spirit of peace and contemplation? We need to recover that. These are the higher things in life. These are the things that are most important to us. If I could give you $2,000 and say, go with the people that you love, it might be your spouse, family member, a friend, for a 3-day weekend, what would you want to do if it had to be an experience gift? Wouldn't part of that be to have a great meal in a great place in a beautiful setting, have time to actually talk about the things that matter? So schole is pretty important. I want to say just a little bit more, and I think I've gone a little long, so I want to just finish up. Schole is doing this is sometimes harder for us to do in America than just to do a lot of hard work in a kind of frenzied state. We have a hard time slowing down. We do. So it's going to take effort, paradoxically, not to be at effort. It's going to take work not to be in this total world of work, as Pieper puts it. And this is the book that really uncovers this idea. He says that, there's two aspects to the mind. This goes back to the medievals. There's two aspects to a human mind. the ratio, which is that part of our mind that is doing the researching, the thinking, and the classifying, and the collecting. Very important to be human. Good stuff. It is the rational part of us, which is good. On the other hand, there's the intellectus, and the intellectus didn't mean, high IQ and so on. It meant that part of us that receptively gazed upon and contemplated that which is true, good, and beautiful. Intellectus is related to the Latin word intuo, which means to intuit, to see, to gaze. So you gaze at something without any intention of actually using it in some kind of practical way. It's to gaze and to contemplate apart from immediate action, and to be able to have time to let something kind of roll over you, wash over you, something that's true, good, and beautiful. That's an important part of being a human being, and it's an important part of our education. It may not always translate in a one-to-one correspondence kind of way to a higher salary, but it will humanize us and make us enriched people. So is there time to contemplate? And it gets back, of course, to multum non multa and festina lente. Here's something else that Pieper says. He says, it's only the person who has not learned how to be at leisure who can be bored. And of course, leisure here does not mean the American vacation where you check out mind and body. It's actually a different kind of work. It's a kind of work that involves receiving that which is true, good, and beautiful. Well, there's so much more to say there. That's a very important point. The Greeks said they actually had a phrase, schole agen, which meant to do leisure. Leisure was something that you did, and you did it often in community. That's what the symposia were all about. Symposium simply means getting together to have great conversation with drinks. Sim with posia, drinks. So to get together with people, have good food and drink, and discuss the things that really matter. That needs to become part of our education as well. So are you doing good discussion? Do you have time to do it, or are you always restricted to 43-minute periods? Many classical schools have moved to block timing where they can have a double period, if you will. So if they're going to be studying literature or doing a study of history and literature together, they might have 90 minutes together where they can really relax and lean into a discussion that involves contemplation. Well, I'll stop there. I want to thank you for spending your time with me, and I'm, of course, hoping that you won't forget 75% of this by the next week. I'm hoping that it will just be 50%, and that if it's been valuable to you, you'll come back and look at this clip again. You can just fast forward to the particular section that we're at, and maybe that will be of some help to you. I also want to close just again by making mention of some books. Desiring the Kingdom on Embodied Learning by Jamie Smith. The Intellectual Life by Sertalange on the educational virtues. And on this topic of schole, or leisure, Joseph Pieper, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And one more book I'll mention, The Great Tradition, subtitled Classic Readings on What It Means to be an Educated Human Being, edited by Richard Gamble, a professor at Hillsdale College. I wish I had this 15 years ago, because it's original readings from Plato to the modern time by the greatest thinkers about what education really is. It's not something you'll read through necessarily in 6 months, but to work your way through this over a couple of years will greatly enrich you, and you'll be going right to the primary sources, right to the fount. And that is its own value. Once again, thanks for joining me.